Okay, so welcome to Blender 101, an intro to Blender. I'm super excited to see this many people really interested in learning about Blender, and I'm really interested in giving this talk as well. And how I'm going to structure this is I'm going to be giving like a really short presentation, around like 5 to 10 minutes, just going over Blender and why it's so great. And then we'll go straight into Blender, and I'll explain how to make that IV bag that you guys saw earlier. So just a bit about myself. Um, I'm currently a first year BMC student. I've been using Blender for quite a while now. I've actually been using it since high school. So it's about like 8, 9 years, but I've been using it like on and off, and I only really seriously started using it about 1 year ago. So these are a few of the works that I've made in the past, and what we're trying to make today is going to be hopefully this little guy. We won't be able to animate him, unfortunately, but hopefully we'll be able to get like a little model of him done. Um, so there's a lot to do, but I'll try to be quick and concise. Okay, so first of all, why even play around with Blender? So I think there's three really big reasons why. Number one is that it's free. Number two, it's very competitive. And number three, there's a great community surrounding it. So starting off with free, I think everyone likes free programs. I don't think anyone has ever like rejected an offer to use a free program because there's no cost to you. And when comparing 3D softwares, seeing a free 3D software is usually like unheard of because 3D softwares can be really, really expensive. It can cost upwards of thousands of dollars per year. So seeing an open source and free software that you can use for 3D things is really great for both hobbyists, freelancers, and big companies as well. The second point is that it's very competitive. So the first thing you might think of when you hear free program is it probably means that it's not as good, right? That is totally not the case because Blender gets a lot of funding from really big companies, including people like from AMD, NVIDIA, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Unity. So there's a lot of big companies really feeding money into Blender. And as a cause of this, it has a lot of great features that you see in all of these other 3D programs and a lot of unique features as well. So I would even say that Blender has a really good set of features that you don't see in a lot of other programs, and it can be used to create really high quality production videos. And the other thing is that development just continues to improve. Blender is constantly improving and really listening to its audience, which is really great to see in a program like this. And the final point is that there's a really, really good community surrounding Blender. Because of the fact that it's free, there are so many tutorials available online. Just as reference, I was searching for a rubber ducky tutorial last month, and I found like 3 or 4 really good ones on YouTube. And they're really high quality tutorials too. So just from a learning aspect, Blender is really, really accommodating to beginners. So I think if you're a beginner or a hobbyist or even a professional looking to enhance your 3D toolset, then this is a really good program to learn. And the other thing is that there are multiple forums to ask questions. So if you have a really specific question, there are forums that you can submit your questions to, and people will gladly answer. Okay, so what can you do with Blender? I feel like I'm hyping it up a lot, but you guys really haven't seen the functionalities yet. So if you can dream it, you can probably do it with Blender. You can do 3D modeling, 3D animation, ray trace rendering, and real-time rendering. If you aren't accustomed to these terms, ray trace rendering basically means rendering with physically based lighting. So it kind of mimics real life and the way that light interacts with objects. Real-time rendering isn't physically based, so sometimes the lighting might not be as accurate, but it's very, very fast. And that's something that a lot of 3D programs don't actually have. So that's pretty unique to Blender. And then it also has a really good sculpting tool set. You can do rigging, 2D animation, not something you see a lot, VFX, motion graphics, video compositing, kind of like After Effects, scripting, etc. So, it's kind of like a blend of a lot of different programs, hence Blender. But I have these little GIFs lined up over here that I'm going to explain a little bit. And this first one over here in the top left is by an artist named Daniel Bystedt. And he's a phenomenal artist. He does a lot of real-time rendering, and this harkens back to this real-time rendering over here. And that render engine in Blender is called Eevee. So the great thing about Eevee is that it's real time. And just as you can see in this video, what that means is that you can look at the object that you're working with and look at the lighting and the textures in real time while you're posing the character, moving it around, and there's little to no lag. So this is really amazing for look dev because this means that you can really focus on the creative aspects of whatever you're creating and make it like perfectly the way that you want it to, which is difficult when you're using ray trace, which is really slow. The other thing, this is a little character that I've been working on recently. It's a little baby Batman, but the reason why I'm showing this is because Blender has a really complex node architecture that's already set. And if you don't understand nodes, that's totally fine. It's not a very beginner-friendly topic, but for people that already have experience with other 3D softwares, you might understand what nodes are. And Blender, I just wanted to show this to show that Blender does have a really prominent node architecture set. And I created this node set to animate the eyes so I can animate blinking, frowning, anger, etc. This GIF right here is a clip taken from this really amazing artist named Deduce. And he uses Blender to create these really awesome and unique looking 2.5D animations. And this is what I mean by 2D animation. You can actually draw in 2D and then also implement that into a 3D environment to create these really cool and unique sort of looks. So that's something that you don't see in a lot of 3D programs. And I think it's really, really cool that you can do this. And then finally, on the top right is a clip taken from one of Blender Foundation's full feature-length animations. And this is like showing you the peak of Blender. This is what you can do. This looks like a Pixar movie, and this just goes to show how amazing Blender is and what the capabilities of it are. So if you ever had any doubt about the functionality of Blender, I hope this kind of dismisses those because Blender is a really, really good program. Okay, so here's a little meme I found on Reddit, just comparing other 3D programs. So when you're looking at other 3D programs like Maya, ZBrush, or Houdini, you're almost always kind of like, oh, I wish I could do that. I wish I could do this. But then Blender, you're that smiling duck while using Blender because it can do everything. Okay, and then finally, I just wanted to end off the presentation by giving some learning resources. So obviously, I won't be able to cover everything that Blender has to offer in this 1-hour workshop because Blender is very complex and you can spend years trying to master this program. But I found some really helpful tutorials in my journey in learning Blender, and I just listed them right here. You can take a screenshot if you'd like, but I think I'm also going to be sending this to Alex and Julia, and they'll be posting it along with the recording. But there's the Blender official YouTube channel, which goes over like general UI features and certain tools. But that's a really good way to get introduced to how to use Blender. Blender Guru, he does sort of the same things, but with specific tutorials, and his tutorials are very, very high quality. Flip Normals does sort of the same thing. Default Cube does procedural node network, so if you're interested in learning about nodes, he has a lot of videos on that. Southern Shadi talks about basic modeling and character creation. If you're interested in using Blender for sculpting, Grant Abbott has a really comprehensive set of tutorials for that. And then if you're more interested in using Blender for science and the specific like molecular visualizations, then there's a whole bunch of add-ons that you can use in Blender. And these two channels, CG Figures and Brady Johnston, they both really go deep into how to use Blender for science. And then some good web pages for inspiration or help. I look at r/Blender all the time. There's some really good people that post on r/Blender. And I've posted some of my work on r/Blender as well, because a lot of people give critical feedback, which is useful for my learning. If you want to learn about these specific tools, Blender has some really good documentation set out in docs.blender.org. And then finally, another forum that you can use to ask questions is blenderartist.org. Okay, so that was a really quick crash course introduction to Blender, but now let's actually get started in Blender. So if you don't already have Blender opened up, go ahead and open that up. And I'll give you some time to do that while I take a sip of my water. Okay, So hopefully everyone has Blender loaded up now. And the first thing you'll see is this splash screen. Now the splash screen might look a little bit different depending on the version of Blender that you have. I currently have the latest version, 2.93.0, but you should be okay as long as you have a version of Blender that's greater than 2.8. So don't worry if it's a little bit different. And as with most splash screens, you get the normal like different file types that you can open. You can open a file, you can look at recent files, etc. Now we're just going to click away from that because we don't need to look at any of those. And immediately what you see is a very paneled layout, and you can see this huge 3D viewport right in your face. The first thing you want to know is how to navigate around the scene. Now I have an add-on enabled called Screencast Keys, and this will let me show you what buttons I'm clicking and also my mouse layout. So if I'm holding the middle mouse, you can see it there. So hopefully that will help you. In case I forget to explain what I'm doing, just look at this bottom right corner. So in order to rotate around the scene, what you want to do is hit the middle mouse button and just drag your mouse. That will rotate you around the scene. In order to pan around the scene, you want to hit the middle mouse button and shift. And that will help you pan around the scene. And then finally, in order to zoom in and out, what you want to do is just use the scroll wheel and zoom in and zoom out. Now, for all my laptop users out there, in case you don't have a 3-button layout, what you can do is go into Edit, Preferences, find the Input tab, and you can check Emulate 3-button mouse. And what this will do is it will emulate the middle mouse with Alt and left mouse button. So I'm just going to check that just for demonstration purposes. But now, if you are running on a laptop and you don't have a mouse with you, what you can do is just click the Alt button and left mouse click, and that should rotate you around the scene. Alt Shift left mouse should pan you around the scene. And then zooming in and out is the same thing, just scroll in, scroll out. So I'm going to disable that for now. And also, if you are thinking about using Blender a little bit more full time, then I would highly recommend getting a 3-button mouse because it is very useful. It really speeds things up, but you should be okay with a laptop too. So the next thing I want to look at is a little bit more about navigation. So if you look at this gizmo over here, if you click on the Z, that brings you to top view. If you click on the X, that brings you to another view, it's like side view. If you click on the Y, that brings you to front view. So these tools right here are really helpful for just navigating as well. And we'll be using that a little bit during the creation of our ID bag. And now let's talk about how to add objects into our scene. So right now we can only like really navigate, select objects, but how do we add something new? If we go over here to the top left, you can see there's an add menu. If we click on that, we get a whole bunch of options to add. The ones that we'll be focusing on are mainly the mesh. These can get a little bit more complex, and I wouldn't recommend exploring it too much for beginners, but really explore this one, understand it a little bit more, and then once you have time, explore these a little bit more. But we'll go to mesh, we'll add in a UV sphere, and you can see there's a little outline of a circle right inside our cube, and that's because our sphere was added in the center of the world. So we have to figure out how to move this out of the way. In order to do that, you can use these tools on the left-hand side. You can see this first one is move. So if I just click on that, we get these 3 axes that come up on the sphere. If I just move this blue arrow, now you can see I'm moving my sphere. I can move it along whichever axis I want. And there's the same thing for rotation. If I click on rotate, I now have these 3 sort of spheres that surround it. I can rotate it on the x-axis. I can rotate it on the z-axis. And I can rotate it on the y-axis. And of course, this white circle around it is also a rotation point. If I rotate that, then that just rotates it from my current view. Okay. There are also hotkeys that exist, and I would highly recommend you guys to also learn the hotkeys. And they're pretty intuitive. So for moving, it's G. So if you click on an object, I'm going to click back to select box. So that brings me to the select box option. So I'm just going to select my sphere. And if I want to move, then the hotkey is G. G for grab. So now I can move this. And if I left mouse click, then it will set my object to wherever I place it. I'm going to Control Z. If I move it again, and if I right mouse click, then it will cancel that operation and bring it back to where it was. And then rotation and scale are also really simple hotkeys. It's R for rotation and S for scale. And I'm just right-clicking to cancel those operations. So those are really useful hotkeys that you'll be using really, really often. So I encourage you guys to try to use those over these, since these can be a little bit slow. Okay, so the next thing we want to know is, so I'm going to delete this sphere. So right now, what we can do is, I see a question from Julia.
Oh, yep. We had a question in the chat from Jennifer, who wanted to know if Blender has unlimited undos with the Control Z.
Yep. So you can actually change the amount of undos. The ones that are default, it's not unlimited, but you can pretty much go unlimited. There's a whole lot of undos that you can do, but that usually isn't a worry of mine. I can undo almost unlimited amount of time.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next thing we want to know is, right now what we can do is we can select our cube, move it around, I can rotate it, I can scale it. Okay, so I'm just going to undo those, but I can't actually change how my cube looks. Right now, my cube is just a cube. I can't move the vertices around. So how do I do that? Well, if you look at the top left, there's an option that says object mode. And this is the option tool that lets you to set the object interaction mode. So if I click on that, you can see there's object mode, edit mode, sculpt mode, vertex paint, etc. The one we're focused with is edit mode. So I'm going to click on this and click on edit mode. So now immediately you can see there's a bunch of dots on every vertex. And if I just select one of these dots and use the same commands, G, R, and S, I can start manipulating the geometry and changing how my cube looks. So this is the basics of 3D modeling. The very basics is just going into edit mode and just pushing and pulling vertices until you have a shape that you want. But the next question you might have is, okay, I can move things around. How do I add vertices, since this is really low poly right now? There are a couple ways that you can add vertices, and they can be used for different reasons. But the first one I'm going to show you is adding a loop cut. So if you take your mouse and hover it over an edge, press Control R, and you'll see this sort of yellow line that is highlighted around the cube. So if I just click on that, left click, now I can change the position of where I want that loop cut to be. I can set it right over here. And now you can see I have 1, 2, 3, and 4 new vertices that I can play around with. I can move these around to change the geometry, and that makes it look a little bit different. Now, I can also Control R to add the loop cut. If I left click, and if I want it to be right in the dead center of this edge, then I'll just right click. So now it's in the dead center. I'll do that again, Control R. If I want more loop cuts, what I'll do is scroll in. And now I can add as many loop cuts as I like. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. And the other way that you can add more vertices is if I select all, I can click A to select all. So now all my vertices are selected. I can right click And if I click subdivide, what will happen is Blender will automatically create a new loop cut across all of the faces in order to give me that extra geometry. So I'm going to subdivide it one more time just by right-clicking, clicking subdivide. And now I have a whole bunch of vertices that I can play around with. So now if I select the vertice and move it around, you can see it has a smaller influence on the object as a whole, but this means that I have a lot more control as well. So I can start manipulating the geometry in whatever way that I want. But say I want to influence this so that like on a broader scale than just one vertice. The final tool that we'll be looking at is this tool right here. So if you move your mouse up, you'll see this little target icon. Just click on that, and this enables what's called proportional editing. So now if I click on a vertex and try to move it, you'll see that this little circle comes up with my selection. And if I start to move it, it's actually influencing everything in that radius of the circle. If I want to increase the radius of the circle, what I do is scroll out. So now a larger amount of vertices are being influenced by that circle. If I want to decrease the amount of vertices that are affected, then I scroll in. And I can just left click to set. And there we go. We can make some really cool changes to this just by using proportional editing. And you can see how if I now change to object mode, you get this like really funky looking object. But you can play around this and make really cool looking objects too. Okay, so that was the basics. Those are all of the things that we need to know in order to make our IV bag. So now I'm going to try to go through the steps of creating our IV bag. So I'm going to delete this. And if anyone has any questions right now, feel free to ask. I'm going to take a sip of water.
We do have one question from Jennifer. Can you see the mesh and vertices in object mode?
Okay, so I'm gonna undo. So you cannot see the mesh really. So I mean, you can kind of see the individual faces, but you can't really see the mesh. What you can do if you want to see the actual wireframe is if you look at the top right, we have these 4 circles over here, and these are different view modes of the 3D viewport. So right now we're at this second circle. So if I go to that first circle, you can see I can now see all of the different edges, the vertices. So that's one option you can do to see the vertices in object mode. But ideally, you'd probably want to be in edit mode to see the vertices a little bit more clearly, since when you're in edit mode, there's a little black dot that is at every vertice. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay, so I'm going to start with the IV bag dude. So what we're gonna do in order to make this IV bag is we're gonna try to simplify things as much as possible for us. So there's a few ways that you can make this IV bag. I'm gonna use this annotate feature. You don't have to follow along for this. This is just for me showing you a few options in order to make this IV bag. So one option is, I could start off with a cube. This is my cube. And what you do is you can probably go into the sculpting mode and then just sculpt in those creases in order to make this look like an IV bag. You can push and pull vertices and really like just spend a lot of time to make this look the way you want. And there's some advantages to this in the fact that you can make this very customizable. You can push vertices to the exact position that you want them to be in. But this can be a little bit time consuming. And I always like to save time because why do lots when little do trick? So the thing that I will do is I will start off with a plane. So this is my plane. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to think of this IV bag as a sort of popcorn bag. So we start off with a plane, and you have all your little kernels, but it's essentially flat. When you take your popcorn bag out of the box, it's essentially flat. And then you can add something called a cloth simulation in Blender. And this will essentially like bake our popcorn so that the bag sort of blows up. And that will give us those natural creases without us having to do any additional work. So that's the thing that I'm going to do. And I'll show you guys how to do that now. So I'm going to hide those annotations. And now what we want to do is add in a plane, because that is going to be our base mesh. So just go into Add, Mesh, Plane. The hotkey for adding an object is Shift-A, so you can do that as well. Mesh, Plane, and that should add it in the center of the world. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a silhouette of our IV bag. So the silhouette should sort of represent how an IV bag looks. And how we'll do that is by going into edit mode. So I'm going to go into edit mode. And I want to see this in top view. So I'm just going to click on that Z. So now we're on top view. And usually I haven't seen any IV bags that are square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to scale this. So make sure proportional editing is off when you're doing this. I'm going to click scale. And I want to restrict this to the y-axis. So to do that, I click Y. And now I can only scale on the y-axis. And I'm going to scale it to about the size that I think an IV bag should be. Probably around there. Now you can also use these tools as well. But I just use the S hotkey. Okay, so hopefully everyone is at this stage. And now the next step we need to do is add more vertices. So how we'll do that is by first adding in a few loop cuts. So I'll go over this edge, Control R. I'll scroll up one time. So now we have 2 loop cuts. And I will click to set that. I want these to be in the exact middle. So I'm just going to right click to set those in the middle. Okay, so hopefully everyone is at this stage. And now I also want one loop cut going down the middle. So I'm going to hover my mouse over here, Control R, click, right click. So now we have 6 squares. Still not enough vertices. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to box select everything. And we're going to right click, subdivide. Still not enough. So I'm going to subdivide that again. And probably 2 more times. So 1 more time here. And this looks like a pretty good amount of vertices. Now you can add as many vertices as you want, but just remember that the more vertices that you have in your scene, the slower your computer is going to be, because you don't want too many vertices in a scene that's just going to bog down your machine. So now we have this. And what we want to do is sort of pull out these edges to make it look more like an IV bag. So what I'm going to do is select these 2 vertices, turn on proportional editing, and scale them up a little bit. I'm going to reduce my radius a little bit by scrolling my mouse, scroll them up, and I'm also going to move them upwards a little bit. So I'm going to click G and Y to restrict it on the y-axis. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. We want to do that to the bottom 2 corners as well. So select that vertice and that vertice.
We have one quick question, sorry to interrupt. But Colleen was wondering, what's the best practice for knowing how many vertices are enough?
I think it's just experience. So it also depends on your computer. So if your machine is a little bit more slow, then you might want to reduce the vertices. But I usually just base it on eye. And I don't know if that's something that is used in industry or something, but based on my experience, like as a hobbyist, I've just been basing it on eye, and that's usually been working pretty well for me. But you never want to get too dense. So it really depends on how fine you want your changes to be. So for something like this, I think this is a pretty decent amount of vertices. I might have even been good to go with fewer vertices, but always, I think it's better to have fewer vertices than more. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we will select these two vertices and we'll move them down a little bit. So G, Y. Okay, so now that's kind of looking like a chip bag. Okay, so what we want to do is give them a little bit of a belly. So we'll select these two vertices in the center, F to scale, and just expand that a little bit. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. Now you can spend as much time as you want adjusting this, but just for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to say that this is pretty good. I'm going to go back into top view. And the next thing that I want to do is I want to add those two little, I guess, vessels that connect to the IV bag. So there's two little things that come out of the IV bag to connect the tubes. So I'm just going to select 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'd say it's pretty good. And if you want to add new faces, what you can do is E, and that does an extrude. So E is the hotkey for extruding faces and vertices. So I'm going to do that. E again to extrude. E again. E again. And maybe one more time. I think that's a pretty good length for the tube. And we'll probably add one more, maybe around here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. E to extrude. E to extrude. E again. And I'm really trying to keep these faces all squares because that helps with the cloth simulation, since cloth simulations really work best when the topology is all roughly the same. So since we have squares over here, I'm going to try to maintain that squareness over here as well. Okay, so I'm hoping that everyone is at this stage now. So what we're going to do is pop out of edit mode into object mode, and we're going to mess with physics and start to add our cloth simulation. So if you look at this panel right over here, this is the properties panel, and this houses a lot of different options that you can modify your object with. What we're looking for is this little, it looks like a planet orbiting a sun, and this is the physics property. So I'm just going to click on that. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different physics simulations that you can do. What we're looking for is cloth. So I'm going to click on that. And immediately you're presented with a whole list of different numbers and words that might be intimidating. But the good thing is a lot of these values are preset to a good number, so we don't have to mess with a lot of them. What I found though, so if you click on this little hamburger icon, there are preset cloth fibers that are already set. So if you click on something like rubber, then the numbers change to accommodate for a rubber preset. And I found that clicking on rubber gives me the best sort of simulation. So we're going to try to use rubber. So if you could just click on that hamburger icon and then click on rubber, that should set all of the values to represent rubber the best. Now, in my experimentation for creating this IV bag, there are a few values that I had to change. So I'm just going to tell you what those values are and why I changed them. The first one is pressure. So if you just scroll down, you'll find an option called pressure. Make sure you check that option. And then set the pressure value to 3. I found that that works best. And what pressure does is, like harkening back to that popcorn analogy, is it adds a pressure inside the cloth and then that will blow it up a little bit. So we're adding a pressure of 3. And then if you go under shape down here, just open that tab up. Set the shrinking factor to negative 0.1. And what this will do is it will give us those creases that you see on the IV bag, and that will make it look really realistic. So we'll set that to negative 0.1. And then finally on field weight, just open that up and set gravity to negative 2. And this is going to make it so that our IV bag doesn't droop with gravity, but it's actually going to inflate. Okay, so cool. Now we can actually run the sim. So if you look at the clock tab, there's going to be an option called cache. Open that up. And what cache does is this is going to what we call bake the sim into our timeline over here. And that's going to allow us to scrub through the simulation without any lag. So Blender is going to do all of these calculations beforehand so that we can seamlessly look through the animation easily. So I'm going to set the simulation start to 1. So this is frame 1. And we don't want to simulate for an entire 250 frames. 50 frames should be enough. And finally, just click bake. Okay, so it doesn't look like anything happened. You have this like blue line in your timeline. But if you scroll through your timeline, you can see something's happening. And that does not look right. So what's happening is you can see it kind of looks like cloth. It kind of looks like rubber, but the whole thing is flying upwards. And the reason for this is because we haven't set any pin groups. So Blender is looking at this object and saying, okay, so we're adding negative gravity, we're adding some pressure, so this thing's just gonna fly up. We don't want that to happen. We want to tell Blender that there are certain vertices around the object that we want to set as pins, and everything else should be blown up into it. So it's kind of like a parachute. So how we're going to do that is go into object mode or go into edit mode. So go back into edit mode. And we're going to have to select some vertices to set as our pin group. And what I found through my experimentation is that I found that these three sets of faces plus the outer edge of vertices plus this set of faces right here, these right here, and these right here, along with these edges, are good sets of pin vertices. And I think this hopefully makes sense because if you pin these, then you have that little flat rim on the top of the IV bag that you see. You want to pin down the sides so the sides stay attached to the plane. And then you want to set these as pins because you might have like a little lip on the bottom of your IV bag. And finally, these two edges are also pinned because you only want these right here to be blown up. You don't want these sides to be blown up. So hopefully that makes sense. And now what we'll do is get to selecting all of our vertices. So you can individually go and select all of these vertices by just shift selecting, but that's going to take way too long. So there's a faster way of doing it. If you click Alt and select one of these edges that are going horizontally, then you can select that whole row of vertices. So now we're going to do Alt Shift, click the next row, click the next row, the next row, and I think that should be good. So now we want to select these outer edges of vertices. So I'm going to hover my mouse over the vertical edge and Shift, Alt, Select. Shift, Alt, Select the left row. And finally do the same thing for these. So Shift, Alt, Select. Shift, Alt, Select here. Shift, Alt, Select here. And for this last row right here, Shift, Alt, Select right there. But we don't want these vertices right over here. So to deselect from a selection, what you want to do is press Control, and then I can just box select these out. Okay, so those are the vertices that we want to pin. So these are not going to be affected by the cloth simulation. And in order to have these saved in Blender, we go down to this triangle looking tab. And this is the object data properties. We click on the vertex groups, make sure that's open, and click on plus. This will add a vertex group. And now if we click on assign, what this does, it doesn't look like anything's happened, but if I deselect everything just by selecting outside, and now if I select this and click select, that saves our vertex selection. So now we can use this vertex group in order to tell the class simulation, this group, we want to pin that down. So we can actually rename this by double clicking it and just typing pin group. So you don't have to rename it, but I think naming things is best practice. So it's really useful to get used to naming things. But now that we have that set, we're pretty much good to go. We will go into object mode, go find our physics properties again, so that planet rotating around the sun. And we need to delete our last bake. So we need to delete our bake every time we change any options. So delete this and find shape. So find that shape property again. And you can see there's this menu called pin group. Select that, and you can find our pin group that we made earlier on. So we'll select that pin group. And now this physics simulation knows, okay, those vertices, we're going to pin them down. Those are not going to be affected by the class simulation. So now, moment of truth, we're going to bake this one more time. And if I scrub through this, oh yeah, okay. So there we go. We have basically half an IV bag. We got all those natural creases, and this is looking pretty good. Obviously, we only have half right now, but there's a super simple fix to adding the other half. And I'm actually just going to turn off these notes so that we can see a bit more clearly. But what you want to do is...
Quick question, sorry to interrupt again. Would you mind going over how you pin down the selection? So I think just before we did the simulation again, how we actually set the vertex group and pinned it.
Yeah, no problem. Okay,
Thanks.
so I'm going to go all the way back to frame 1. And if we go into edit mode, so I selected all of the vertices that I wanted to pin. And after I have those selected, I go into this green triangle. This is the object data properties. And I'm just going to get rid of this again. So what I do is I click on the plus icon under this vertex group context menu. Click on the plus icon to add a new vertex group. And once you have this selected, click assign. And what assign will do is it will assign all of these selected vertices to this vertex group. So I'm going to click assign. And what happens now is if I deselect everything and go under here and click select, Blender remembers this group as that selection. So even if I have something else selected and select away, I can click select and it'll remember those vertices as that selection. So I can rename this now to pin, and now I can assign this to that physics group. So hopefully that clears things up a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to go back into object mode and just reset that pin group. So what you want to do is find shape, pin group, select that pin group that you just made, that vertex group, and then click bake. And now when you scrub through your animation or your timeline, just find any frame that looks good to you. I think that looks pretty good to me. Looks pretty plump. And what we need to do next is add the other half. So how I'm going to do this is I'm going to find the modifiers tab, modifiers property, and it looks like a little wrench. Click on that and add modifier. If I click on this, there's a whole bunch of different modifiers that you can use to modify how your object looks. But the one we're looking for is a modifier called mirror. And you can imagine what this does. It kind of mirrors our object across a certain plane. And this doesn't look right now because it's mirroring it across the x-axis. I'm going to deselect x, and I'm going to select z. So what this does is it mirrors it across the z-axis, and now we have a total complete little Ivy bag. And it kind of looks more like a pillow. I think I should have made this a little bit longer. And you can also play around with these settings with pressure and shrinking factor. But this is looking pretty good right now. What we need to do now is make it a little bit more high res. It's very low res right now. So there's another modifier for that. You go to add modifier, subdivision surface, click on that. Now you can see it's a bit more high res. And I can change the levels of subdivision just by increasing this number right here. So I'm going to change this to 2. And this looks a lot more high res. And the final thing you can do to make it look a bit more smooth is if you just go to your object and then right click, you're going to see an option called Shade Smooth. If I click on that, Blender automatically smoothens out all of those flat faces. So that is a really simple tutorial on how to make an IV bag. Unfortunately, we didn't have too much time to go over material shading or anything, but hopefully you guys, if you're interested, you guys will find some tutorials online. Material shading is very, very simple, but hopefully this is a really good introduction to Blender. And I'm really hoping that you guys will try to look more into Blender and learn about it, because it's a fantastic tool.
We have a question from Jennifer, which I don't think has been asked yet. Can you scale at this point to change the shape?
Yeah, so one thing that I want to mention with the modifiers is, if I select this object and now go into edit mode, you can see it's still this flat plane. And the reason for that is because these modifiers are all things that they add after the fact. So this can be nice because that means that these are all what we call procedural, and they don't actually change the mesh of the object. So that means that I can work with this really simplified mesh, but have these really complex shapes show up. But then if I want to actually change like the actual surface and more details about this, then what I want to do is apply these modifiers. So if you look at this caret over here, you click it and click apply. And I'll also apply this mirror modifier. Now, if I go into edit mode, I can see that this is a whole shape now. So I can individually move this, make it like have a gut or something, but I can also now scale it properly. If I tried scaling it before I applied these modifiers, it wouldn't work. Hopefully that answers your question.
If folks don't have any more questions, we'd like to encourage you, if you're willing, to share your IP bags that you've modeled on social media. We do have a hashtag for the BMC 75 events. It is hashtag U of T BMC 75. If anybody wants to share what they made, it would be really cool to see.
And I do have a question. Abhishan, will you be recording a second half of this tutorial for finishing it up?
Yeah, I definitely could. I could send it to Alex and Julia, and you can post that as the second recording.
I mean, that would be amazing. That's like a bonus, but yeah, that would be super cool. This was really great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.
And for those of you still here, we will also be sending out, sorry, I'm jumping in, a survey. We'd love to hear what you thought about the class. So keep an eye out for follow-up materials, including that.
My last question, which might be on people's mind if they want to keep on working on this, is there any particular way you should go about saving your Blender files? I know in Maya, there is particular ways to make sure your project is saved. So I'm just curious if there's anything for Blender like that.
So I forgot to mention, but always when you're working in any 3D software, remember to save, because if something happens, like it crashes, especially when running a simulation, then most likely than not, you'll probably lose everything. So really remember to save early. And the way you save is really simple. Just go to File, Save As, and you can find any folder that you want. I'll save it in this one, and I'll call this IV bag boy 2, and you just save as. So it's as simple as that. It's nothing too complex, just saving it, but just remember, always try to save.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Abhishan, for the wonderful tutorial. We're getting lots of great comments in the chat. And if there are no more questions, people are free to go. Thank you so much again, everybody, for coming. And we hope to see you at more events this week. And we'll be in touch soon with follow-ups.
Thank you, everyone.